I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible. Very well then, folks. Welcome back to what may be the penultimate lecture in the series on Cornelius Agrippa, our seminar on Agrippa and his occult philosophy. I say maybe because we have a lot to cover today, and I don't know that we'll cover it all. And if we don't, well, then we'll figure it out. That's just the way things are going to go. But what we turn to today is, in some sense, what we've covered already, which is to say the principal work of Agrippa's occult philosophy is somewhere to be found between the 1510 so-called juvenile draft and the 1533 mature edition, we might call it, of the three books of occult philosophy. And I have to say that it's ridiculous to say something like, when I was making these slides, I got emotional, but that's the kind of thing that only teachers say. But there was something evocative of it, because it was a thing where I was working directly with my copy of the 1533. This is a copy that it's very likely Agrippa would have personally overseen the production of this book. And it's weird to think that Agrippa himself could have literally held this volume in his hands if he was inspecting them as they rolled off the presses. And so there was a strange feeling that came over me. And I don't think of myself as a terribly romantic person or anything like that, but there was something about the idea that Agrippa saw this with his own eyes as it came off the press. This very volume, 1533, he could have touched it. He certainly saw it at some level. He was in the room with it. And there's just something about that connection to me that I don't cuts through space and time and connects me with a person who I've spent weeks and weeks and weeks getting to know, and to know that we cross with this physically at some level. It yeah, it made me emotional. It gave me goosebumps. It was like it was like, the moment you see like Obi-Wan Kenobi as a force ghost behind you. It's like there's Agrippa as a force ghost behind me as I'm handling this copy, the very cherished copy of mine of the 1533. So let's talk about the 1533. One of the most important textbooks, or one of the most important books in the history of Western occultism. And what we have to do is talk about how the 1510 became the 1533. And there on your screen, you're seeing the manuscript copy of the 1510. This is one of the few pages that actually has some magical diagrams that Agrippa has left us. So when we call the 1510 the juvenile draft, I've objected to that a little bit. And my objection really is that, Agrippa was a younger man, that's for sure. So in some sense, it is juvenilia. And he does repudiate some aspects of the 1510, that's to be sure. But he was also 23 years old when he submitted that manuscript in April of 1510 to Trithemius. And also, the considered a draft, I think, is also not quite true, because when Agrippa wrote it in 1510, it was meant to be a coherent, complete book. And the copy that we actually have that was given to Trithemius is, in fact, what we call a fair copy. It is a final draft, a final edition of the book in manuscript that would have been given to Trithemius. And so in that sense, I don't so much like the idea of calling it a juvenile draft, because it puts a kind of teleology as if we're moving inherently historically in the direction of the 1533, and I don't think that's quite the case. I think the 1510 should be read on its own, in its own context, and the 1510, as we'll see, is in many ways distinct from the 1533, as we'll point out as we get into it here in just a bit. But at any rate, what Agrippa argues for in the 1510 is what he calls a reform of magic. He wants to develop a magia reformata, a reformed form of magic. And the way that he does that is by surveying all of the previous literature that he thinks from antiquity that give him access to the true version of magic. Recall, Agrippa very much is a Renaissance character. He really believes in the Prisca Theologia, and he believes that the further back in time that he goes, the more pure and the more true things are. And that insofar as magic has become degenerated, has become corrupted, has become deformed through the historical game of telephone that has passed it down through history, by going back to antiquity, by going back to Hermes Trismegistus, he's able to recover that ancient forms of magic. And he thinks that he's living in a very unique period of time because so much of that information is now available in a way that it was not available to even a couple generations prior to Agrippa. So that's the first project. And again, if you've ever read the 1533, you know that it's a bit tiring because Agrippa is just constantly quoting or quasi-quoting all kinds of historical sources, but that is methodologically how he is operating. So the second thing that he wants to do is that he wants to continue what he believes is the work of engaging in the reformation of magic by continuing the work that's already begun basically one generation prior to him. And these are, of course, done by the names that have become very familiar to all of us at this point. This is the work done by Ficino, by Pico, and by Reuchlin. So in some sense, Agrippa sees himself as carrying their legacy forward. He's inheriting their work of reforming magic that was done just a generation or so prior to him. And Agrippa, in some sense, is thinking that he's going to bring it to an ultimate conclusion. And for him, in the 1510, he does refer to magic as the sublime and sacred faculty of the human being. It is what it allows human beings to become sublime. It is what allows us to become sacred. And it is a unique thing that human beings are able to do. And he structures it in a very Reuchlinian way by dividing things into an elementary region, that's the terrestrial world, the celestial world, and rather than the ceremonial world, the divine world, he refers to it as the religious world. And for Agrippa in the 1510, he wants to engage in what he refers to as a religious reform of magic. And this is, of course, very important because Agrippa believes that what ancient magic lacked, the magic of Hermes Trismegistus, or the magic of someone like Iamblichus, or the magic of the ancient world more generally, Pythagoras or Zoroaster, is that they lacked Christianity. They lived before Christianity, and because they lived before the revelation of the gospel, they all practiced magic kind of through a lens darkly, and that with the arrival of the gospel and magic can be combined, and magic can undergo a kind of religious reform vis-a-vis his very hermetic, Kabbalistic form of Catholicism. And that religious form of reformation of magic will allow it to reach its most flourishing and therefore allow the greatest amount of dignification of the human being and all the things we talked about in terms of illumination. That's the general thrust of the 1510 so-called juvenile draft. That's the thrust of that text. And again, let me just point out a couple things that are worth mentioning now before we turn to the 1533. One of the things that's very clear from the 1510 and then that it becomes less clear in the 1533 is that in the 1510, Agrippa has a very negative attitude to what he calls the modern form of magic. Now, by modern, he means modern to him, obviously. And modern, he means what we would consider the Gothic form of magic. And this would be the general world of grimoire magic, whether it be necromancer's manuals, whether it be the Ars Notoria, whether it be the Liber Juratus, or other kinds of classical manuals of medieval magic, especially magic having to deal with the summoning and binding of demonic entities. Agrippa's very, very hostile to that kind of magic in the 1510. As we'll see, however, in the 1533, he's less hostile to that kind of stuff. And that's an interesting development where in many ways Agrippa seems to be moving away from the overall thrust of the tempo of the kind of reformation brought in by Ficino. Agrippa seems to be more comfortable with more medieval style magic, modern style magic in the 1533. But just to give you a couple of examples of the kind of works that are underneath the hood of this, all the while that Agrippa is disclaiming his dislike for scholasticism and for modernity, he also is smuggling a lot of that material into the 1510. Because of course he is. What else would he be working with? He's living in a world where he's writing in 1510. What other intellectual material does he have to work with but scholasticism? That's the only shop in town. And so, unsurprisingly, under the hood of the 1510 is sort of a tension. And the tension goes like this. On the one hand, Agrippa hates scholasticism. On the other hand, there's nothing else. And so he relies on a lot of it to make it work. And the core text that he really relies on is Albertus Magnus, and specifically Albertus Magnus's De Mineralibus, right? To the his book on the minerals, which is a core text for things like the occult properties of gems, but also his book on Der Mirabilibus Mundi, on the miracles of the world. And it's in that text, when those two texts primarily, where Albertus Magnus works out the idea of the occult sympathies of things. Now, occult sympathies for Albertus Magnus simply means that two things which are alike must share something in common. Their being alike means they share something in common. And because they share something in common, that means they have some kind of causal relationship to one another. You can think about the classic example of metals and planets, or another example would be something like a mandrake root in a baby. There was an idea that mandrake roots and babies had some kind of connection because they kind of look similar for whatever reason. So that's the way this works in Albertus Magnus, and that's typically the way that Agrippa's terrestrial magic works in the 1510. It's a system of like equals like, and therefore there must be a connection, and therefore you can manipulate one by manipulating the other. We'll come back to this more in just a moment because we'll see this is going to change in the 1533. The other major text that Agrippa is relying on is the very famous Speculum Astronomiae, which is basically how Agrippa understands the world. Agrippa is very much a pre-Copernican character. He's relying on an incredibly medieval view of the world, and basically his entire celestial structure is informed entirely by the Speculum Astronomiae. So again, that's another place where he is incredibly medieval. But he's also putting a lot of this medieval stuff into conversation with what one might call the Hermetic avant-garde. And this is putting that stuff into conversation with Ficino's more Neoplatonic metaphysics, but also putting it into conversation with Reuchlin's version of the Kabbalah as Agrippa knew it in 1510. So what Reuchlin calls for by the 1510 is that he's only published at this point De Verbo Mirifico. And Reuchlin's De Verbo Mirifico argues that for a reform of magic away from what we might call transactional magic, that is to say, dealing with supernatural creatures, rather than doing that, we can have a form of magic, what he calls the ars soliloquia, the magical power of the divine name, and you can use that divine name to affect theurgical changes in reality through this special version of the Tetragrammaton with a shin put in there for Jesus. It turns into basically the name of Jesus. So that's kind of the limits of where Agrippa is in terms of what he knows about Kabbalah in 1510. His terrestrial system of occult causation is basically this like equals like sympathy stuff coming from Albertus Magnus. And more or less, he has a basically functional medieval view of the cosmos, and that's going to inform how he thinks about the so-called astral effusions. So by 1510, he does believe that one can, however, take this degenerated magic and recover true magic coming from antiquity and then reform it. So he does believe that's possible. And the way that you do that basically is, for in 1510 at least, if you take all of that literature, you mine all of this new literature coming from antiquity, you put it all out, and you basically say, this is how magic worked in the ancient world. Let's take all the stuff from the ancient world. Let's take all the celestial stuff. Let's take all the stuff we can get from this sort of hermeticized, Kabbalisticized version of Catholicism, and let's just slam them all together. And so in that way, the 1510 is more literary than it is technical, which is to say, there's not much in the text that tells you how to do magic. It's literary in the sense that it is largely a survey, a bird's eye survey of magic from antiquity to modernity, synthesized in such a way that says, this is how a general reform of magic can take place. But as we'll see, it's very clear in books 2 and 3 that Agrippa is not thinking about this from a technical point of view. He's not thinking about this from a point of view of, let's do it. He's thinking about, what is the literary landscape? What is the compendium of magic from antiquity till now, where we can put it all together into one coherent theory of magic? That's what he does in 1510. That's the 1510 juvenile draft to a significant degree. Now, as we've mentioned before, between 1510 and 1533, Agrippa's basically largely publicly silent about magic. Aside from some discussions he has in his letters, he's generally speaking not publicly talking about magic for about 13 years, so far as we can tell, between 1510 and 1533, with the one exception of geomancy, which is hardly magical. It's rather a divinatory art that we can perhaps talk about more. But we have a silence there. Now, you can read that silence in two directions, and we've talked about this already. One direction to read that silence is that Agrippa has lost interest in magic. That's one. The other way to read it is between 1510 and 1533, Agrippa's smart, and he's in an area like in Italy, and he's in the heart of the Inquisition, and therefore talking about magic publicly is probably not in his own best interest if he wants to remain unburned. So perhaps what he does is that he continues his interest in magic, but he's not talking about it in a public way any longer. He's not publishing about it in the way that he would have perhaps in 1510. What is clear between the 1510 and the 1533, however, is that Agrippa is without any doubt deeply continuing to change his understanding of magic, deepen his understanding of Hermeticism and Kabbalah. And so by the time we get from the 1510 to the 1533, we can see that in effect, Agrippa has fundamentally transformed the two documents. The goal of both documents remains the same. That's what the core, the philosophical core, remains unchanged. But qualitatively and quantitatively, Agrippa will have transformed the text in almost every respect. And so as we'll get into the 1533, we'll see that so much of what goes on between the two has been, in some sense, changed, and that the 1510 has now been subsumed into a different, more complex, I think more systematic, more coherent philosophical system. And it's because Agrippa has developed a more sophisticated, more coherent, richer metaphysical system that I think that Agrippa then is able to turn to more operative magic. And the 1533 has significantly more operative magic. The 1510 basically has none, but the 1533, with one exception, the 1510, the 1533 has much, much more operative magic, especially in books 2 and 3, as we'll come to. So why does Agrippa print the 1533 at all? There seems to be two reasons why he prints the 1533. The first is he's asked to do it. The Archbishop of Cologne basically reviews a copy of it, so far as we can tell, and he wants him to bring it to print. So we have the Archbishop telling you he wants you to bring it to print. You do that. Secondly, there seems to have been a threat that a private draft of the 1533, or what became the 1533, was going to come to print anyway. Someone was going to rush it to print. And this happened all the time. The most infamous example of this is Ficino. Ficino had composed a draft of a translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, and he abandoned that draft for reasons that are not totally clear, but he abandons that draft, and that draft is ultimately rushed to print and printed without his authorization. And it's a mess. It's a mess of a text. And that text becomes wildly popular, and it's ironic that a very defective text becomes basically the herald of this new Hermetic reform. Agrippa is pretty smart. He does not want a pirated version of the 3 books of occult philosophy to make it to print, and therefore he gets it to print beginning in 1532. Of course, as I mentioned last time, the Inquisition gets involved. The Cologne Inquisitor ultimately in 1532 in December, right before Christmas, is able to have the printing stopped, and it's not able to resume until the next year. And ultimately, the 3 books of occult philosophy is ultimately finally printed in July of 1533. It takes that long, by the way, because not only is it a pretty elaborate text, but it also has a great deal of woodcuts, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So what's some of the big differences that go on between the 1510 and the 1533? So I'll give you just a couple of examples of pretty substantial differences. Book 1, the book 1 that deals with the terrestrial world, that entire book in book 1 in the 1510 is entirely reliant on the vision of occult magic via Albertus Magnus's idea of sympathies. that gets ultimately dropped or subsumed, I should say, under a much vaster system of Neoplatonic correspondences. Agrippa has gone from what is basically an Aristotelian worldview to what is effectively a Neoplatonic worldview, where we have the great chain of being now. And that great chain of being means that every part of the chain of being is connected together. And those connections, those occult connections, both laterally in the terrestrial world, but also going up into the celestial and the divine world, means that it's all connected into one vast system of correspondences. And therefore, it's the manipulation now of those correspondences wed together through the Hermetic or through the Neoplatonic system of procession and recession, which we famously find in things like Plotinus, but also to some degree in Hermeticism as well. That mechanism now becomes the magical mechanism by which occult causation will happen. So we go from a purely Albertian theory of occult causation via sympathies to an entirely new system, Neoplatonic system, where the processus recessus cycle is actually there undergirding a system of relations via correspondences, and of course also those sympathies. The sympathies are still there as well. So that's a place again where all of book one in many ways has been fundamentally changed under the hood of things. And then what ends up happening is that a great deal of book one is farmed out and changed given that shift in Agrippa's metaphysics. So that's just one example of how, on the one hand, a lot of the 1510 is preserved, but the mechanism, the actual occult mechanism by which magic happens, is totally changed between the 1510 and the 1533. And that is proof to me and many other scholars that Agrippa is not only thinking more and more deeply about what's happening between 1510 and 1533, but he's in fact reforming his own reform of magic. He's deepening the reformation of magic by even changing the initial character of the reform by reforming even his 1510 Reformation itself. The most striking changes between the 1510 and the 1533 are the increases in Hermeticism and Kabbalah. This is the place where Agrippa mentions, he gestures in the 1510, especially in book 3, that Hermeticism, in terms of the exaltative place of the human being in all of this, and the need for human regeneration is key in all of this, and how that is done through Kabbalistic means, that is performed, that is performed via Kabbalah and the relationship of human being to God via a sort of Kabbalistic relation. He gestures at those directions in 1510. But it's between 1510 and 1533 that Agrippa really gets an education in both Hermeticism and in Kabbalah. Most important of all of those are going to be his reading of Plato's, the commentaries on Plato by Ficino. He's going to deepen his reading of Pico's works. He's going to really latch on to Ludovico Lazzarelli. In fact, I would even argue that Agrippa becomes a student of Lazzarelli, and that the Hermeticism of the 1533 is a Lazzarellian style of Hermeticism. So he really brings in a lot of those elements as he's reading them, because they simply weren't published between then and they weren't published before. But the biggest book, there are the two biggest texts that seem to have a big impact on him, are one, the works of Rhesius, which is the big translations of Kabbalistic literature, specifically on the Sphirot, the divine emanations of God via the 10 Sphirot and Kabbalah. The translation of the Sha'are Ora, the gates of light, as the Portae Lucis by Rhesius. And that text has a huge impact on Cornelius Agrippa. And that, but even more than that, is the 1525 mammoth text by Francesco Giorgi De Harmonia Munditotius. This book, which by the way has no modern edition, in fact, to my knowledge, there's only one example online of an uncensored copy. Almost every copy online has been censored by the Inquisition. I think the Bibliothèque Nationale has the only copy on the internet that is the actual complete book uncensored. And it is 1,000 pages long. This is an enormous, enormous text that deals with the idea that the universe itself is structured around divine harmonies, specifically Kabbalistic harmonies. So it is Neo-Pythagorean, it is Kabbalistic, it is Hermetic. It is in some sense probably the largest work produced during the Renaissance of that type. Massively important work of at that time, published again in 1525, so just a few years before the 1533. And almost every page that Agrippa adds to the text that's new, and we'll talk about the new versus the old, almost every single text contains references to De Harmonia Mundi, but even when it doesn't, it contains sometimes even entire paragraphs and lines taken directly from, as quotations from De Harmonia Mundi. So that text is in some sense the decisive big one that is going to transform Agrippa's thinking away from a more medieval Aristotelian scholastic world to a fully formed Hermetic, Kabbalistic, Neoplatonic universe that we find in the 1533. One of the most important books we could have translated at this time to really understand Renaissance Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism is going to be the 1525 De Harmonia Mundi, but it is such a massive text, 1,000 pages of densely packed text. I think it's going to be a generation before we'll see a translation of it, but it is, I think, of decisive importance in the history of all of this. But to give some examples of how Agrippa is going to incorporate Kabbalah, Agrippa will mention Kabbalah in the 1510. He'll give some examples of divine names and the power of divine names, all coming again from Reuchlin and all coming again from the Ars Soliloquia, from De Verbo Mirifico. But it is in the 1533 that we see an explosion. Half a dozen chapters are introduced between 1510 and 1533, as we'll see, where we have extensive discussions of divine names, the centrality of the Sphirot, tons and tons of charts for generating divine names and angelic names that you've probably seen in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, all kinds of angelic and demonic names that are generated by these charts. All of those charts, all of that Kabbalah, all that Sphirot business is all new to the 1533. It's not found in the 1510. So that's a place, again, where Agrippa has deeply changed the mechanism, whereas in some sense in the 1510, he's paying a bit of lip service to Kabbalah. In the 1533, Kabbalah is now front and center, and not just front and center. It is the machinery that drives how one engages in the recessus via one's soul back to the divine by using divine names, by inducing these frenzies, by connecting to these angels, and ultimately sort of riding that all the way back up to the one. The most important element from Hermeticism that Agrippa is going to bring in is not just the microcosm, macrocosm stuff, which is of course very important to Hermeticism. Not only is he going to bring that, he's also going to bring the idea that the world at some level is not fundamentally bad, that the world is itself a kind of miracle. And the most miraculous aspect of that, of course, is the human being. But the human being is, despite the fact that we are the knot of the universe, to use the language that Agrippa loves to quote from Ficino all the time, the human being is degenerated. In that degeneration in classical Hermeticism has to do with the fact that our soul has passed through the spheres, has become infected perhaps with astrological demons, and has been shoved into a body. Agrippa thinks, no, the degeneration has happened through the original sin, and that what needs to happen, of course, is regeneration, and that regeneration can happen in this lifetime. And so that is the Hermetic idea of the exaltation, the dignification of the human being. Whereas in many medieval texts, they have a very low opinion of the human being. Agrippa really embraces in a full-throttled way, as articulated by Ludovico Lazzarelli, that the human being can be exalted, can be subject to exaltation and regeneration, and that idea of being born again, which, by the way, is Hermetic language. That it is so hilarious that the evangelical Christians have really latched on to the idea of being born again, but that language comes via heterodox Protestants, and those heterodox Protestants got it from the Hermetica. And so the language of being born again, it's found in the New Testament too, but Agrippa really latches onto it in a Hermetic sense of the regeneration of one's soul, despite the fact that it is otherwise fallen, and that is achieved through reverence, eusebia, through piety, and a classic way
articulated by the Hermetica that you can, of course, read more about in Wouter Hanegraaff's recent study of the Corpus Hermeticum and the Hermetic spirituality. So that gives you some sense of the big shifts. So given that, let's get a little bit granular, right? This is where I kind of nerd out, where I think a lot of you will nerd out. Let's think about the text structurally. Rather than thinking about big stuff that changes, rather than go through sort of these bigger bird's eye view things, let's think about how the text actually changes from the 1510 to the 1533 forensically. And so the best way to do that is by comparing the two. The 1510 to the 1533 basically doubles in size. Every single chapter, basically, there's some exceptions to that, but almost every single chapter has things added to it, and Agrippa moves things around. So virtually nothing is lost between 1510 and 1533. He doesn't get rid of anything. He keeps everything, basically, but he moves things around. And where a text might be one continuous paragraph in the 1510, he will now expand it. He might move this over here to another chapter, and he might build an entirely new section around it. So you can imagine, if you imagine the 1510 as a puzzle, imagine the puzzle being kind of exploded out, and then all kinds of new pieces added back in, and the whole thing is wed back together into one system again. So the 1510 is preserved. All the major things is preserved. All of the text is preserved. The overall goal of the 1510 is preserved. But the actual puzzle is exploded, filled in with new things, and expanded, basically doubled in size. So I'm going to walk through some of the things that Agrippa adds totally new. So these are chapters that were absolutely not at all in the 1510 that are completely written new in the 1533. And I want to show you by going through this that Agrippa is expanding Kabbalah, he's expanding Hermeticism, but just as much as those, he's making the text more operative. It's going from being a literary survey of magic to being a textbook, at least in some senses, for how to do it. Now, it's not going to be a terribly good textbook for how to do magic, and we'll talk about the sort of it left desire in people's mouths for something more operative, and that's going to open the door to things like the so-called fourth book of occult philosophy. But the text becomes dramatically more operative between 1510 and 1533. So, book one, between chapter 3 and chapter 8, there are totally new chapters, 5 new chapters on how the elements function. So Agrippa has basically given us, between chapters 3 and 8, an entirely new physics. So if you think about a physics engine in a video game, Agrippa has now given us a totally new physics engine. It's no longer the physics engine of Albertus Magnus. It is now the physics engine of Ficino and Neoplatonism. So that is a huge difference in that. We have a new, fully developed theory on how occult virtues work. So it's a wholly new idea of how occult virtues and occult causation work in chapter 13. Totally rewritten, totally brand new. We also have a new idea about correspondences between the sublunar world and the superlunar world. That's not possible in an Aristotelian framework because there are no correspondences between the sublunar world and the superlunar world because they're cut off. The superlunar world does not operate according to the physics of the sublunar world and vice versa. Agrippa has rejected that worldview and has now accepted a Platonic worldview, a fully Platonic worldview, where now there can and there are correspondences between those worlds. Totally new chapter 30. He introduces a whole section on dream divination, right? So now in chapter 59, we have a whole mechanism by which we can engage in dream divination. Chapter 61, incredibly important. Agrippa's anthropology is central to his entire theory of magic. It's all about us and our ability to become dignified. So what does he do? He introduces an entire chapter dealing with the anthropology, the religious anthropology of the human being, deeply informed by Hermeticism and deeply all about that idea of regeneration. Of course, chapter 69 is all about the power of speech and magical words. There simply is no doing magic without a theory of magical speech. Magical speech is simply how magic happens in the vast majority of magical traditions in the Western world. And that shift toward here's how to do it, here's how it works, is where we begin to get a good bit more of the operative business, the theoretical operative sections that are very important if you want to practice Agrippan magic. And finally, at the very end of chapter 74, the last chapter of book 1, we get the system of correspondences and celestial signs. Again, there are no correspondences in an Aristotelian framework between our world and the celestial world. There are no correspondences because there is no connection. There is a causal break between the sublunar world and the sublunar world. And Agrippa now says, no, there actually is a system of correspondences to celestial objects, and those signs and celestial objects can be bound up in a system of correspondence. And now we have, again, a full throttled Neoplatonism that is driving at some level the system of occult causation that is absent in the 1510. Further, we get to book 2. We have a whole new introduction in book 2. And then from book 2, from chapters 4 to 13, almost 10 brand new chapters, Agrippa introduces all of the business of the system of the scales. Why? The system of the scales is the system of correspondences. It is the numerical system of correspondences by which and through which occult causation works, not just at the level of the terrestrial world, but also at the level of the celestial world. All those charts where you list all 10 Sphirot or all 3 parts of this or all these different divine names or all the different disciples or whatever, all those charts you've seen in book 2 are brand new in the 1533 because Agrippa's now dealing primarily with systems of correspondence. Again, chapters 14 through 22, also almost 10 new chapters. Agrippa is now dealing with not just numbers above 10, but also he's introducing those vast numerical and Kabbalistic charts that are so important for engaging in the conjuration of spirits and stuff. But also, perhaps most decisive, are the introduction of the development of the planetary sigils. All those sigils that you see that are famous in the 3 books of occult philosophy, those are completely new to 1533. Those sections are, in my opinion, the closest thing you get to a kind of grimoire in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Those are the most operative sections of the 3 books, and they are completely new to the 1533. Chapters 27 and 28, all about the harmony of the human body and the soul. You get some of those really amazing woodcuts through those chapters as well. Those famous ones of the human body set in different correspondences or different geometric patterns. Again, all of those are new and from chapters 27 to there. Chapter 31, famously, again, this is where the planetary sigils come in. That was originally chapter 31 in the 1510. It's now chapter 52, and you get a whole new set of planetary sigils. So this is a place where Agrippa clearly thought that the earlier planetary sigils of 1510 were not effective, were not correct, and Agrippa gives us an entirely new set of planetary sigils in chapter 52. So that shows us that Agrippa has changed his mind about the operative sigils that are operating for those planets. Again, chapters 32 through 4, 37, 46, these are all sections on operative astrological magic, totally missing from the 1510, but again, a direct focus on the doing of the magical art, specifically here via astrology and the operating on the celestial level. We get a couple chapters on geomancy and divination via lots. You'll note that Agrippa also has given a public lecture in the 1519. 1529. Agrippa's given a lecture in 1529 on geomancy, where he's introduced classical Arabic geomancy, although with an astrological twist. And he also introduces some geomantic stuff there. So divination is now also getting a broader pride of place, because again, for Agrippa, as you become more exalted, you get greater and greater access to learning about the future, and one exalts oneself in learning about the future via divinatory arts, and Agrippa seems to have a strong opinion about geomancy. Finally, chapter 60, this is all about the power of the human mind. It's all Agrippa's theory of mind, and of course, as we've talked about earlier, Agrippa's theory of mind is quintessential for understanding the whole business of illumination and the whole business of dignification, and how the human mind can ascend from this realm in this body up through the celestial spheres into the divine world via the angels, and it's ultimately achieving union with God. That's new in chapter 60. So again, Agrippa has deepened and expanded qualitatively, quantitatively, so much of what's going on in the text that we have a dramatic shift, even in something like chapter 60, which is brand new. Book 3 is absolutely the most altered of all the 3 books. And by altered, I mean it's the most expanded. Book 3 is dramatically expanded, more than doubled in size between 1510 and 1533. And just to give you some sense of what goes on in here, we have a totally new chapter on dignification. That is extremely hermetic. That is all about the need for the regeneration of the human being. That hermetic chapter is now at chapter 3. We have between 10 and 13 a whole new introduction of the Sphirot and divine names. Agrippa talks about some divine names and he gives some examples in the 1510, but now Agrippa has introduced the entirety of the Kabbalistic machinery of the Sphirot and specifically how to generate various divine names in the between chapters 10 and chapters 13. Also, in chapters 18 and 19, Agrippa tells us a little bit about demons. Now, one would be shocked to think Agrippa's so down on the idea of, demonic conjuration via grimoires, and yet Agrippa cracks the door a little bit. Yeah, he says not to do it. Yeah, he says it's not you shouldn't, and it's beneath you, and it's against your dignification. And then Agrippa cracks the door for whatever reason. He says, yeah, but also here's some demonic stuff too. Just FYI. You shouldn't do it. It's bad. They're gonna trick you. But just in case. Chapters 18 and 19. I think that's interesting. I think this is a case where, again, Agrippa seems very down on that kind of stuff in 1510. He's at least cracked the door open to it now. He talks about the genius, which is one's personal guardian angel, in chapter 21, also missing from 1510. That personal guardian angel is part of the vehicle by which one returns to the divine. There is an explosion between chapter 23 and 31 where we get all those beautiful alphabets, like the alphabets of the angels and the so-called Theban alphabet, where we get all these Kabbalistic tables, where we get how to do all the spirit name derivation, where we get these amulets. Agrippa includes all these amulets in chapters 23 to 31. Basically, it is a Kabbalistic how-to guide that Agrippa packs into chapters 23 through 31. And again, these are some of the most operative sections of the 3 books of occult philosophy, specifically engaged in the practical use of Kabbalah in the interest of the exaltation of the soul. Chapters 33 through 35 gives us some sense of the divine ecology, gives us some sense of what's up there, what to do with the entities that are up there. 38 and 39 give us a deeper, more detailed understanding of both divine and celestial inspiration. Of course, illumination is core to Agrippa's occult philosophy. In chapters 38 through 39, 38 and 39, deepen our understanding of what it is to say that we are divinely inspired, or we have celestial inspiration, celestial illumination, divine illumination. We get a bit more on the afterlife of the soul. Agrippa discusses what happens if you're bad, you can become a ghost. More on astrology via lots in chapter 52. Also, chapter 61 and 62. These are weird. These are also, again, about consecration. So they're more particular. They're more operative. 61 is about interacting with spirits. Something that Agrippa in general in 1510 was very reticent. He did not like the idea of interacting with spirits. He thought in general that smacked of old grimoire, modern magic. Agrippa here cracking the door back open for the possibility of more transitive magic that is actually much more like grimoire magic, we might say, than it is like Ficinian magic. Ficino's magic, of course, is very much all about the exaltation of the individual. That's a shift from 61 to 62. And also in 65, at the very end of the 3 books of occult philosophy, we have an extended epilogue. And in that extended epilogue, Agrippa basically says, I've hidden all kinds of stuff in this text. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. You have to figure out what it is. You have to figure it out what it is. And so we're left with a bit of mystery. We're left with a bit of mystery about the text. I should say also, right, the text also now contains a wide variety of woodcuts and charts and figures. Those are all missing from the 1510. And so we might summarize it by saying this. Between the 1510 and the 1533, the entire system of occult natural causation has been transformed. No longer the old medieval Albertus Magnus system, now a fully fleshed out Renaissance system based on Neoplatonism. Celestial magic is rendered far more operative than it is in 1510. So now we have a basically very bare bones but functioning system of celestial magic, and especially in the form of sigil magic in book 2. And now divine magic is fully infused with operative Kabbalah, what we might call practical Kabbalah, Kabbalah Masit. And Kabbalah Masit now dominates book 3 in a way that, while it was paid lip service in 1510, is now replete with Kabbalah in 1533. Thus, the philosophical core of the 1510 is maintained: illumination, exaltation, dignification. Those core ideas are maintained between 1510 and 1533. The text of the 1510 is maintained. But again, it's exploded, rotated, changed, altered, moved, expanded, and changed in terms of both metaphysics and physics. So we have a qualitative and quantitative increase and change. And this all demonstrates what I argue is Agrippa's evolution to his commitment for magic, his commitment to magic, not his disavowal of it, not his skeptical skeptical dismissal of it, not a rejection of magic, but I would say a very specific deepening of Agrippa's commitment to magic between 1510 and 1533, but along very specific vectors. And that's exactly what we should expect given the 1526 De Incarnatudine, where Agrippa has sharpened his critique of things. But that sharpening of the critique does not mean he's rejected things. It's just now meant that his focus is now zeroed in, it's lasered in, and he's now like really keyed into very particular ways of doing things. And those are the things that we see rejected in the 1526 De Incarnatudine, but expanded and exploded and explained in the 1533. Agrippa's magic's not gone anywhere. It's gotten deepened, sharpened, focused. He's cleaved off things. He's gotten deeper into this. He's gotten more hermeticism. He's focused in very particularly on certain aspects of Kabbalah, but at no point in this journey has magic been abandoned. It's just been focused, sharpened, and qualitatively and quantitatively deepened, in my opinion. And I think is evidenced by the 1533. However, this can all be counteracted by the appendix. As we've talked about before, at the end of the 3 books of occult philosophy, there is an appendix. There are 3 letters and 8 chapters from the De Incarnatudine appended to the end of the 1533 that you do not see, unfortunately, in the 2 recent English editions, and you do not see in the critical edition, unfortunately. So that without reading those 3 letters and without looking to look at those 8 chapters from the De Incarnatudine, I think it alters how you come away from reading the end of Agrippa. So I'll talk a little bit about these letters. We have 3 letters composed between 1527 and 1528, 2 of which go to one person, a priest, and the other goes to an anonymous person over in Germany. And I think that what we get in these letters is, again, a clear vision of what Agrippa is actually thinking about in terms of magic between the Skepticism of 1526 and the ultimate publication of Agrippa of the occult philosophy in 1533. These letters are a window onto what Agrippa is actually thinking about magic. And what do they reveal? Surprise, surprise, Agrippa's still convinced that the real thing that matters is divine illumination. That's what matters. Surprise, surprise, he's been talking about it since he was 23. It's been years later. He's still beating that drum because I think that's a good drum to beat. But, right, magic is just a propedeutic to that. Again, something we've already learned in 1510. And the ultimate goal is, again, felicitas, felicity. So this is nothing new. This is classic Agrippa. We should not be surprised here. So I think that's unsurprising ultimately. Magic is not the end goal. Felicity is the end goal. Magic is both a means and a boon. However, Agrippa does get a little sneaky on us. He does say in his letter, listen, I know you got a lot of questions about magic, but we got to talk about this in person. Why? Because these kinds of secrets should only be transmitted orally. They should not be translated in writing. So there is a kind of sense in which, yeah, you can write about magic, but really the real teachings, they transmitted orally. That's a very Kabbalistic kind of thing, right? The true Kabbalah is never the Kabbalah that gets published. The true Kabbalah is always the Kabbalah transmitted from student to teacher. And so the printing is sometimes you can think of the idea of the black fire on the white fire. The black fire is the printing, the white fire is the oral tradition. And so, yeah, the printed stuff you read in the Zohar or whatever, that's just 50% of it. The real Kabbalah is done through the oral transmission, the oral reception, right? Kabbalah, you receive it. And Agrippa says, we got to talk. If you really want to know about magic, we got to talk about this in person. But I'm going to be bringing the occult philosophy to print, but you'll need a key to understand it. You'll need a key to understand it. and I'll only reserve that key for a few elite people, including my friends, including you. So you'll get a key. But the rest of us, schmucks, we're not getting a key. So Agrippa secretly tells a person in a letter, just so you know, the printed version is not going to be what you need. You're going to need something in addition to the printed version. Secondly, in another letter, November 9th, 1527, Agrippa says, look, I can lead you to the gate. I can bring you to the water. I can show you the promised land, but I can't go there with you. And I can't go there because I've not lived the kind of life required of a person to get illumination. I've 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 bloodied my hands in war. I've lived my life as a bureaucrat. I'm married to a wife and I have kids, and I've just never seen it. I've never been illuminated, and I'm not going to get illuminated. It's the ship sailed for me. It's over. So I can bring you to the gate, he says, and I can point you in the direction. I can show you that way, but that's as far as I can take you. There's a kind of exasperation that we sense in Agrippa, the kind of sadness where he says, "It's not going to happen for me, guys. I've given you the text that's going to, I can give you the compass, I can give you the map, but you got to go. I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm not going to be able to do this. It's just not in the cards for me, not in the stars for me, perhaps. Here it is. You have to do it for yourself." And so he can point the way for others, but he's never going to get there himself. He's a Moses-like character. He can see the promised land from the top of the mountain, but he says, "Good luck, Godspeed. Here's the book, right? You'll need the key to get there. And maybe I can give you the key if I can talk to you." But at the end of the day, Agrippa seems to believe that it's not going to happen for him. And there's a bit of, I don't know, I feel when I read those, I feel uh, deeply sorry for Agrippa. And again, he comes through as so earnest. This is not a wink, wink, nod, nod moment. This is something he said repeatedly. And I think that I think it's a sign of deep sadness on his part, but also what enormous courage to say, I might not make it, but I'm going to work hard to produce a text where others might. It's a very heroic kind of thing. It's the kind of thing you would expect out of someone like perhaps a soldier that Agrippa in fact was. The last letter that we get is Agrippa's laying out and lambasting a would-be German wizard. There's some German wizard who I don't know who it is. I can't find out who it is, but some wizard has come to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor and is alleging to be able to do all kinds of things. And Agrippa basically says, "This guy's a charlatan. This is, he's just he's in league with the devil, if anything." And ultimately, allegedly, he can fly and find buried treasure and divine the future. And Agrippa thinks this is just one more piece of trash to go in the trash bin of history. And basically says at the very end of the letter, "Look, I shouldn't write any more about this, otherwise I'm going to get carried away." Agrippa just hates this guy, this sort of so-called German wizard, and he says, "Look, we need to maintain an enlightened view of magic, and magic is about illuminating the human soul. It's not about parlor tricks. It's not about getting people to fall in love with you. It's not about finding buried treasure. As much as I would love to find buried treasure, we have to have a high reform theory of magic." And Agrippa says, "Look, this guy is just like all these others. They're charlatans and false prophets, and they are devil worshippers. They should be chided as such, and they should be avoided. Those forms of magic in general are to be scorned." And finally, and most infamously, this is how the three books of occult philosophy ends in the recent translation made by Dr. Dana Trell. This is how it ends. Agrippa includes 8 chapters from the De Incertitudine on magic in general, on natural magic, on mathematical magic, on witchcraft, venificia, which really can mean something like poisoning, on Goetia and witchcraft, which there it means Goetia and black magic, on theurgy, on Kabbalah, and on trickery. And finally, on the chapter on trickery de prestigiis. By the way, this is a technical term for what demons do to people. Demons trick people, and it's this. You can even hear in the modern magic, like the prestige is the moment where you trick the audience. That prestigiis is from the Latin for trickery, but it particularly has to do in this case with theological trickery committed by demons. I'll read this. Agrippa writes, "It's true that while I was a young man, I wrote about magic in 3 books of considerable volume, which I entitled On Occult Philosophy. Whatever errors I made then in account of these was a part of my curious youth. Now I more cautiously wish to recant this with a palinode, for I wasted much time and effort on these vanities in the past. In the end, I achieved this. I know by what means one should deter others from the peril. For whatever presumes to divine in prophecy, not in truth nor in power of God, but in the deception of demons according to the operations of evil spirits, and whoever boasts of working miracles through magical vanities like exorcisms, incantations, love charms, binding spells, or other demonic works, and the frauds of idolatry which conjure up illusions and phantasms, will quickly fade away. All these, together with Janus and Jambres and Simon Magus, Janus and Jambres are the 2 mages that dueled with Moses and Aaron with their staffs in the Egypt story. All these together with Janus and Jambres and Simon Magus will be condemned to torment and eternal fires." That's how the text of 1533 ends. Now, there's a simple way of reading that, which is just to say this is a full-throttled, a full-throated rejection of magic from my youth. All of my youth, all of that 1510, all of that stuff was just a mistake. But notice what Agrippa actually says. Whatever errors I made then. He didn't say it was all an error. He said that he may have made some errors back then. What has he done between 1510 and 1533? Dramatically changed the text. Maybe he did believe he created errors back then. And maybe he does believe that the 1533 is a correction for those. Also, when you look at the 3 books of occult philosophy, do we see things like working miracles through magical vanities like exorcisms and incantations and love charms and binding spells? Is there any of that in these books? No. He doesn't do that. In fact, he tells you not to do things like that in the 3 books of occult philosophy. Does he tell you to divine and prophesy not in truth in the power of God, but through deceptions of demons? No, he tells you exactly not to do that, that one can only prophesy and divine through being illuminated. On the one hand, this looks like a disavowal of magic. If you read it cursorily, if you read it quickly, if you read it not carefully. But if you read it carefully, he's just saying, don't do all the things I told you not to do in the 3 books of occult philosophy. And it turns out that none of the things he enumerates are actually things he tells you to do in the 3 books of occult philosophy. It's a disavowal of the things that he disavows about magic, not a disavowal of his magic. But if you read it quickly with the scanning eye of the Inquisitor, you can read it as if Agrippa's saying, hey, I wrote this when I was a kid and it's all trash. Don't believe it. But if you read it carefully, what you're really seeing is, yeah, all those mistakes I made in 1510, maybe I corrected them. And also, all the things I told you not to do, well, I don't tell you to do those things either. This has often historically been read as a retraction of the 3 books of occult philosophy. I don't think he's retracting anything. I think it's a very careful disclaimer to say, hey, look, the thing that you don't like, the magic that you condemn, the magic that you don't like, I don't like that magic either. And therefore, I think that we read this too sloppily if we take it to be a disavowal of the occult philosophy. It's a disavowal of errors he made in 1510, but it is not a disavowal, I think, of the entire project that he started in 1510 and brought to a conclusion in 1533. So we have a lot of questions. How is this epilogue functioning? Did he put it there? Did the printer put it there? Did the inquisitors force him to put it there? Did he want to end the 1533 at the end of book 3? But he decided to put some more stuff there at the end to like give him some plausible deniability. So what Yates believes. Is it a disclaimer, like I say, for the Inquisition? What's this text doing at the end? And I think that's a great question to grapple with. Do we get a mature idea of Agrippa's thinking in the sections at the end? Maybe. Is that his last word on the topic? I don't know. Does it discredit the 1533? I don't think so. I don't think what we get by appending those 3 letters and those 8 chapters from De Incartudine to the end of the 1533, I do not think it is a disavowal of the book. I simply do not believe that, and I think that's contradicted by the evidence, the internal evidence of the book. After this time period, from roughly around 1531 to 1533, the last letters that we have of Agrippa, what do we see? Agrippa is asking for more books of Kabbalah. He's trying to find really rare books, actually, of Kabbalah. So in the years up to 1533, he's deepening his interest in Kabbalah. He's continuing practicing alchemy. We have lots of evidence of him practicing alchemy. We have his incredibly fiery defense of the 1533 three books of occult philosophy against the Cologne Inquisition. So we have his defense of the 1533, which again, if he wanted to throw it under the bus, he could have thrown it under the bus. He doesn't throw it under the bus. He defends it to the Inquisition. And so again, we have evidence that he is not simply disclaiming the text as nonsense. But by mid 1533, around the time of the publication of the three books of occult philosophy, Agrippa's letters, they just vanish. You don't know if he didn't write anymore. He probably did. They've been lost. And because we get almost all of our information about Agrippa from the letters, we don't really know what happens next. He seems like he goes to Italy, perhaps to teach alchemy. He ends up in France. He gets arrested, probably for debt or something else. He's not really a welcome person in France anyway. And then in 1535, we're told by his student Johann Weyer that he dies. He dies in 1535, and he is ultimately buried in a Dominican church, in the very church of the people who hounded him his entire life, the Dominicans and their Inquisition. He's ultimately buried in a church in 1535, and his grave goes missing. We don't know exactly where in that church. That church still stands, by the way, but we don't know where in that church he was buried, and so it is impossible even to visit his grave, unfortunately. By 1535, Agrippa had passed, I think, more into legend than into history. And this is by 1535, not long after his death. We will begin to get the legends of the black dog and all of the stuff about the devil, and Agrippa was tormented to the end by the devil and all this, that, and the other. But the truth of the matter is, so far as we can tell, his friends rushed to his rescue when he was arrested in 1534. He seems to have had admirers and friends all the way until the end. We don't know what he perished of in France, but at the end, it seems like Agrippa was still active in the world of alchemy, still trying to find books of Kabbalah, and still being Agrippa all the way until he ends. And in 1535, he passes into legend and into history, and he dies. What we do know is that the 1533 did spark a huge interest in his magical reformation. But many people, as we'll see next time as we wrap up this seminar, they wanted more out of him. Agrippa gave them, I think, one of the greatest signposts in the history of spirituality, a signpost that echoed the idea of human dignity, that magnified human power, that suggested that the human goal in life was to exalt one's soul and one's mind by reverence for God and seeking illumination and using magic in the interest of human beings. Every time we find Agrippa, he's trying to help people. He's helping people in Antwerp with the plague. He seems to be constantly interacting with people to get them access to books. And he seems to, Erasmus reaches out to him to get education for one of his students about occultism. Agrippa seems to have really saw himself as a servant of, again, pointing the way to a kind of divine illumination, pointing the way to an exalted, magnified vision of what human beings were and what human beings were capable of. And I think that he's left one of the greatest signposts in the 1533 for what human beings are capable of spiritually, even at the level of something like we called science, uncovering the occult forces that are all around us. And people wanted more from him. And one of the things they wanted from him was the most base kind of magic. People wanted magic to get stuff. They wanted magic to interact with demons and get stuff. And not long after Agrippa died, do we find pseudo-Agrippa texts being written like the fourth book of occult philosophy. So what we'll do next week as we wrap up this seminar, as we abandon this seminar, we certainly don't end it because I think that there's far more to access in Agrippa. The Agrippa well is far deeper than I'm able to sound. But as we abandon this seminar next week, what I want to talk about is the influence that Agrippa had, the legacy that Agrippa has left, And I think that legacy is quite mixed. And one of the things that I hope what I can accomplish in this seminar is by giving a whole generation, a whole group of people access to what I believe is one of the most beautiful types of spirituality developed in the Renaissance, especially for people for whom practicing magic is an important part of your spirituality. I think Agrippa gives us a beautiful vision of the human being, a beautiful vision of illumination, a beautiful vision of human dignity. And I want to see how, as it develops, how in some sense that vision of Agrippa's magic was preserved, but in most it was not. And so what I want to show is his legacy is quite mixed, but we're part of that legacy. I'm part of that legacy. I'm holding in my hand part of that legacy. We're all part of it now. And I think that insofar as we can come to Agrippa and bring forward what I think is an authentic vision of Agrippan magic, of Agrippan ideas about humanity, I think that we will carry something incredibly powerful into the future. And I look forward to exploring the legacy of Agrippa, both as he's come down to us, but also the legacy that we're going to have to deal with insofar as we are now part of that legacy. So next week we'll turn to what we inherit, what is living and what is dead in the philosophy, in the occult philosophy of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim.